I started doing translation rather late. My experience of translating at school was miserable. I wasn't really very good at languages, and just because I was living in Italy, obviously I had to learn the language, and then found I tried out a few translations. Nothing came out very well, I think actually the first one that I felt happy with was a contemporary poet you might know of, Valerio Magrelli, and I just saw a poem of his, L'Abbraccio, and thought, I didn't quite know what it was. I thought it could go into English and I could do it, and more or less that's how it happened. Then about maybe 6 months later, I tried another of his poems, and that time I was slightly freer with it, and again I felt it worked. Then, so I kept on doing the odd one by Valerio's poems, and some of them not as successful. So I mean, obviously didn't have any method. It was like beginner's luck. The first two. I think for translation, particularly with poetry, maybe you need like a bit of luck. I don't think. I mean, just as in writing a poem, the right climatic conditions have to be there, or just something works. You're in the right mood. It's very different. My experience of translating prose, which I subsequently had to do or accepted doing for the last 5 years of my life. I mean, it feels a bit, even with a really good prose writer, it feels a bit like drudgery. There's just so many words. What was it some poet described a novel as a long piece of prose with something wrong with it. When I translate it, there's even more wrong with it. But anyway, it's that process which is just laborious, basically. And I've always found that translating poems was kind of hedonistic. It was fun. I mean, it's frustrating when you don't get it, but then you can always chuck it away and then start another one. It would only be fun if you didn't like the original, I think. I mean, it would only not be fun if you didn't like the original. I don't know, probably all of you, because some of you will be teachers, some of you students, probably all of you have had quite a lot of experience of translating. Right.
A lot might be overstating it, but some of us probably had a lot of experience, and others.
Of course, and in different languages. I mean, you're represented from...
Yeah, French, Spanish, Italian, and German are all here. And anything else? Galician.
Oh,
exactly.
Galician.
Sorry, I knew I was making a mistake. I knew I was leaving somebody out.
And you got Galician and next and Lagadores.
Yeah, Lagadores, yeah.
Irish.
And Irish, exactly. Irish language, absolutely. So quite a few, actually. Yeah.
That's very good. I mean, Antonella, you've had experience of kind of translating poetry, but you haven't really had to do much prose, have you?
No, I translated a prose by Anne Carson.
From Anne Carson, yeah.
Clearwater.
But is that like a poem prose? That's the kind of blurred borderline. But in a way, when you're translating something like Anne Carson, you're translating a poet.
Yeah.
Same in a way for me with Bassani, because Bassani, as you may know, started as a poet and continued as a poet. Actually, quite a good one. I think his prose is better, but so I suppose that was one of the things that drew me to him. My next, more extended experience was, Mary kind of noted the Faber Book of translations of 20th century Italian poetry I edited, and where possible I got translations from other people ready-made for the book. But then others, where there were gaps and poets I felt ought to be represented, I sometimes ask people I knew were interested, or I had Italian, and I liked their translations, and sometimes ended up doing them myself. So, in a way, rather too full of me, the book. I've done about 25 poets in the book, and that was quite engaging for me because, I'd like to think that there are really different voices. So there was a question last night about ventriloquism. I'm not sure I quite would call it that, because it's always mediated through your own kind of range of syntactically, rhythmically, whatever. But I would like to think that my translations of Ripolino was kind of ironic Sicilian poet, was completely different from Pasolini, that you wouldn't necessarily recognize the same person. I think there are poets maybe would be happier to be more recognizable. Elaine, what do you feel about that? Because you've done quite a few different...
Are you asking, would the original poet like to be more recognizable?
Well, across, like, if you've done translations of several people, are you easy with your own style being there and apparent? Or?
What I'm really aware of, I suppose, is my own prejudices. I had a particularly interesting run-in with my Romanian poet who doesn't speak English and speaks very poor French, who uses the word empire, which for me has a very negative meaning. And I found that for her, coming from Ireland, on the other hand, for the Romanians, the lost empire of Constantinople is terribly important. So there was a bit of negotiation to be done about this, and I felt that I was having to overcome things which belonged in a different voice from mine. And then she has a prejudice. Well, all Romance languages there's an unfair advantage because you can rhyme on a past participle, and she does it all the time. And then she wanted me to rhyme, but the rhymes would have been much more forced if I had stuck to that, and I refused to do so. So, I mean, actually engaging with someone with a very strong voice of her own, and trying to recognise that voice and still not to produce something which I thought would be inferior as a poem, or wouldn't mean the same thing to an English-speaking reader, was an interesting experience. But I think a lot of the time, it is to some extent dictated by what's there in the original, isn't it? I mean, Antonella, I find, the meanings of the original words are more important than any sort of rhyming or any sort of fluency, which she was deliberately avoiding. And I think maybe it's easier to suppress one's own voice in some cases than in others.
Yes, that's an interesting point, because I suppose all of us, in a way, when we're confronted with something, we just try and deal with it with whatever strategies we have, and if rhyme works, then that's fine. If it doesn't, you try something else. So it sounds like kind of unsystematic, pragmatic kind of way of working, but actually that doesn't exclude having a kind of aesthetic sense of both what's happening in your own language and the other language. You may have all come across translation studies is now emerging it's quite a strong thing across, the English-speaking world in America and in England now. And some of the theories I find very unhelpful, actually, when it comes down to it. I mean, it is a flourishing concern, and I think it's a good thing to study for students. But I get very skeptical about the theoretical basis, not just because it's theory, but because it's often like, it talks about one of the crucial images they talk of domesticating or estranging strategies. But when you're dealing with poetry, you're dealing with really strange right the way through often. So, I mean, it's a double estrangement that you're dealing with. I mean, it's not like as reading some of the theoreticians, I could think of examples, but they might not mean anything to you. But you know, an English person reading Italian or an Italian person reading English, we're not dealing with, you know, somebody from Mars. A lot of the terms we share. I mean, if the language is Chinese, then we're already at a far greater remove. But you know, and also there's a kind of false politics I think comes along with that. Is that, you know, because of the hegemony of English, it's associated with empire and so on, therefore it feels like you're kind of co-opting some smaller language and grabbing it if it goes that way. Whereas actually it's just, I mean, it's a level playing field for a poem, you know, I would think. Whether you have X number of readers or X times 20, it's still a small number of readers.
Would you make an exception? Would you think poetry then is an exception or case in the whole field of translation?
Well, yes, except that then you'd start having to add even more exceptions in. I mean, like if you had Joyce, I mean, how would you make a distinction between that? I mean, it's just 100 times better than most poets. So, and his use of language is so much more dense than most poets. So you, or to take another example, like Malcolm Lowry. I mean, that would be really exacting. Or from Italian, somebody like Emilio Garda. I mean, that would be a real test to put into. Bassani, what I'm doing, which I'm doing, is it has these very intricate, complex sentences. I didn't explain my point very well, but what I'm saying is that I can give an example, like, let's take an extreme-ish example in English, Gerald Manley Hopkins. Now, his style we can all recognise, we might describe it one way or another, but it diverges radically from the norm of spoken English, of his time and of our time, of any time. And yet, it's rooted in that spoken word. You know, the mind has mountains no man fathom. Holden sheep may he who ne'er hung there. We have a rhythm, which is a speech rhythm, played across in the weirdest way with full of alliteration. So if you're translating that, you've got a lot of very, very complex decisions to make. How much alliteration, you know, in a Romance language, of course you can alliterate. Does it have the same resonances as it would? The compacted rhythms of Hopkins and the musical phrasing, is that something you want to retain? You know, there's a lot of losses already kind of queuing up outside your door, and you've got to negotiate with all of those things. So my point about, yes, I would say it is a special case, is that it's not good enough to talk about estrangement. I mean, as I say, Hopkins is so strange, and yet so natural to the language. And every poet, almost every poet, is using a language that he or she has made deviate somewhat from the norm. So it isn't really whether you're representing Italian well, let's say, if it's going into English, but it's being able to register the ways in which the poet you're translating distinguishes him or herself from the norms of speech and getting some kind of equivalent. So you're dealing with something fantastically complex. I mean, I'm not saying you achieve it, but was it Brodsky said that poetry translation is probably as complex as any human activity, with the possible exception of astrophysics. They said it much better, but he said it really is. It doesn't mean, I mean, lots of us who do it are quite dim, but it's, you know, it still requires such a lot of different things to be happening on so many levels to do it well. And yet it's done very well. One of the things I was slightly objecting to last night is some of the discourse of poets, which is rather kind of patronising towards the plodding, boring translator who just happens to know the other language. I think it's not fair, because actually you can think of lots of non-poets who've done tremendous translations of poets that most poets could learn a lot from. I mean, I just think of Cavafy in, is it Shepherd's translation? And the two, do you remember Keeley? Keeley and Sherwood. Sherwood, sorry. Sherwood. I think that's beautiful. I mean, maybe there's an argument that Cavafy just goes very well into other languages for reasons that make him not as difficult to translate maybe as some of his contemporaries. But I'm just thinking of another thing, the husband and wife, Bogdana Carpenter, who did Zbigniew Herbert. I mean, neither of them are poets, but God, it's so much better than most poets that you'd read, really. So I was looking through this George Steiner anthology the other day, and that had lots of really famous poets, but one of the best pieces of work was a sonnet written by a Dutch guy, of a Dutch poet I'd never heard of. I'm sorry, I can't remember either of their names, but it was one of the best poems in the book. So I think, I think particularly in British society, where languages, language departments are dying out, people are not studying at schools, I think poets could actually start choosing a different way of talking about it and encouraging people to learn the language rather than patronising those people who do it. I don't think it's a kind of slightly aggressive defensive move, because they obviously feel a bit guilty not knowing the language. And knowing the language does not guarantee your superior handling of a poem. I mean, so I'm torn in two ways about this. I'm sounding ambivalent because I am, is that quite few of the poets who do translation without knowing the language, I think do such a good job of it that you want them to continue. You just don't want them to be writing there afterwards or forwards, kind of talking about the process where they don't, they rely heavily on other people's work, and I think they should be a little bit more humble about it. I mean, I can only imagine in Britain where, a major Spanish poet, one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, Antonio Machado, is effaced from the cover. We've got Don Patterson, The Eyes, or Don Patterson, Orpheus for the Rilke sonnets. I mean, can you imagine anywhere else in Britain? I mean, you'd have to have, I'm not just kicking Britain, but the provincial notion that somehow it's more important to be the original poet. I think it, may be a good sales strategy, so you don't get bogged down in the boring, dowdy world of translation. This is and then you call it versions rather than translations. And my feeling that I'm very, very sceptical about this neat division that's being offered. And my students who I teach some classes in translation keep on talking about using the ugly gerundive versioning. I mean, it really isn't a nice word. And actually, it assumes too many things that's different. I mean, any person translating a poem, whether they're a poet or not, wants to turn it into a good poem. They're not just plonking down words as if there's some literal equivalence. They're trying to think through the line. Anyway, I'm repeating myself from last night, so I better stop that. And as I say, some of the work is terrifically good. What I wondered was whether it's worth doing a quick exercise. With that, I mean, you've got a poem. Actually, I did two just so I had a choice. Would you like to read the? I'll just say a little bit for a moment about Attilio Bertolucci. Is the father of the filmmaker Bernardo Bertolucci, and actually he's got another brother who's a filmmaker. But I think that her B is for Bernardo. It looks like it's written to his son. I think it's a relatively early, but it's a very beautiful kind of melancholic, lyrical tone to it. But I wondered if, because it could be, you can do quite a lot of work very quickly, but we could just have a stab at translating and talking about some of the problems involved with it. Hans, do you want to read it?
Very beautiful translation by Philippe Jacotet.
Into French for that. Is Jacotet in a kind of a book of translations by Jacotet, or it's not an entire book of Bertolucci's?
No, I can't remember the name of the book, but it's sort of a collection of translations. by Italian and Russian as well.
It would be nice to see that actually. Yeah.
Lire à trois cordes, quelque chose comme ça. Per me, i piccoli aeroplani di carta che tu fai volano nel crepuscolo, si perdono come farfalle notturne dell'aria che si oscura, non torneranno più. Così i nostri giorni, ma un abisso meno dolce li accoglie, di questa valle silente di foglie morte e di acque autunnali, dove posano le loro stanche ali, i tuoi fragili alianti.
Terrific. I mean, so Elaine was talking about rhyme, and I think actually it's a very interesting thing that you said about the past participle that rhymes. But of course, it would be like not a very good rhyme. Do you know?
Yes, I think in Italian people would avoid it.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I think, but
in Romanian, not.
Apparently, it was frowned on by poets of the sort of early 20th century, and it has now it's now considered to be acceptable. Or at least
the rules have got slacker.
Yes, something like that. Yes.
Because I think exactly in I shouldn't say, but I have a feeling that past participle rhyme ato or whatever would be a little bit facile. But it does raise an interesting question because, you know, like people say that Italian is a very rhyme-rich language. I notice even Eliot, who should know better, says that, well, you may be right. And Clive James's recent translation of the Commedia says how it's dead easy to rhyme in Italian and difficult in English. Well, I was thinking, then he gave examples just of the finale, but I would have thought for Italian, a finale doesn't constitute a rhyme. So there's no point in just having oh. I mean, that isn't a rhyme. You'd have to have, you know, two syllables at least rhyming. Is that true? I mean, here's an example which might be, you could consider an exception, where tu and ju is rhymed. But you would call that more assonance than a rhyme. Do you see what I'm saying? Is that I'm saying it very badly, but I think for Italians, it's a little bit more exacting to get a rhyme than just having a finale.
Well, accoglie and foglie would be a full rhyme. And
that's a very good one.
And ali and alianti would not.
Okay. That's not right. Autumnali and ali would be a rhyme, because that's two syllables. Accoglie e foglie, which is at least two syllables. And then aliante is not a rhyme, but it's like a hypermetric rhyme, because you've got the ali bit, then covered by the ante. So it's a strange muted rhymed effect at the end. But you've pointed out exactly right. So what you've got is autumnali. Have I spelled that wrong?
Yes, something has corrected you, I think, probably.
Oh dear. Yeah.
Because
it should be autumnali. Sorry for that.
Is it T-O-N?
A-U-T-U-N-N.
Yes, no M.
Oh yeah, no M.
No M.
Yeah.
So invece di M, it's N. I don't think it might be my computer, but it could just be me. Actually, but that's quite good, because what you've got here in the first stanza is such a minor rhyme, tu and pu, but it's setting up a little signal that there's some accord across that. Then the second one, as you say, a full rhyme, like an enclosed rhyme, accoglie e foglie, and then autumnali, ali, aliante.
And fragili too, fragili as well.
I'm not hearing for
Fragili.
Fragili. Oh yeah. I mean, so there are a lot of kind of, I mean, this is the sound effects, which came out very beautifully in the reading. So certainly you've got a structure there of sounds, which is slightly, it's not conventional, but it does have a kind of sense of resonances and play of language, which you may a little version, so for those of you who don't have Italian, the small paper planes which you make fly into the dusk, I think che tu fai, volano, into the dusk, lose themselves like nocturnal butterflies in the air that darkens. They will not return. Thus are our days, but an abyss less gentle receives them than this silent valley of dead leaves or autumn waters, where, and then this is the inversion much more possible in Italian, where lay down their tired wings your fragile gliders. I mean, that's another big problem for the English, is that the possibility of sentence structure inversion is much less acceptable for us. I mean, occasionally you got it in Romantic and Victorian poetry.
Yes, I think a lot of people who are translating into English but who don't have English as a first language assume that because it's in the Victorians that you can invert.
Yeah.
And it simply now feels hopelessly wrong. Yes, exactly. If you do it in English.
It basically just sounds would-be poetic and naff, really, doesn't it? It's
Yes.
like it's not. I didn't even sound great in the Victorian age, but it depends.
I seem to have got away with this thing.
Yes. One other thing you've got is, I mean, Elaine, you were talking last night about how, as a translator, you move closer to the original via imagery. And I think this poem offers a very interesting example of that, a very strong thread of imagery, which has a lot to do with darkness, darkening. So you've got crepuscolo, dusk, si perdono, lose themselves, as in maybe lose sight of it. You've got farfalle notturne, which is, it could, I guess, but they have a proper word for moths, falena. So it could, there are specifically nocturnal butterflies, I think. Any
I think so. I think
entomologists?
I saw in a zoo once that there was a kind of a darkened room with nocturnal moths and butterflies.
And they're not moths. There is a species distinction. They are butterflies.
They are butterflies?
But I'm not sure whether he just wanted to use the word nocturne to give more depth to the darkness. Anyway, I think for a translator, you could make a choice there.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have to be. You wouldn't have to observe this.
My butterfly book says they're all the same, that there's no biological distinction. But I'm not sure that it's right, actually.
All right. But I've learned something then, because I thought there was some distinction, but there isn't.
Yeah, I think when I think of moths seem to have heavier bodies, but
I thought.
Well, you said there's no difference anyway between butterflies and moths. They're all the same. So
that's what there are just some of them fly by night and some by day.
No, but I'm just trying to understand.
That may be right. Well, then he should have said moths.
People prefer the sound of farfalle.
Yeah.
Farfalle is a wonderful.
It's a lovely word.
But you've got,
And a darkened word.
if you're keeping with crepuscolo, notturno, and oscura, there's a whole kind of semantic cluster of darkness.
Exactly. Yeah. And you've got soscura, the
and
darkness.
Nocturnal moth wouldn't really.
I think that's why, as an option for translating, you could really, you could go. I mean,
You said it earlier on. There is something strange about poetry, and that's what has to hit you. The strangeness of poetry itself. So a nocturnal butterfly seems to me perfect as a translation, because it is an odd thing.
I'm not hearing all of
Oh,
this.
sorry. Say it again.
Sorry, you said earlier on about that poetry in and of itself is a strange thing, and it does strange things with words, and I suppose that is an image that does make you think, well, what is he saying? You're not just reading those lines.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it starts quite early in the poem. It establishes. No, it's a very. I hadn't thought of that.
Because you're talking about a child's thing, paper airplane, and I don't know. I personally would always associate butterflies with children anyway. So there is a kind of that level as well, the vocabulary is about children and childhood.
Sure.
Do we want a Google answer to the butterfly moth?
Why not?
It must be true because it says on the internet that almost all butterflies are active during the day, almost all, but by no means all moths are active at night. A good way to tell the difference is by their antennae. Butterfly antennae are shaped somewhat like a golf club with a long shaft. Most moths have either simple filaments tapering to a point or complicated affairs with many crossed filaments. So that was just A, that there are night butterflies, and B, and it could easily be wrong, that there is a distinction based on golf clubs between butterflies and
Okay, so just
moths.
put that through Google Translate what you have there, and we're probably sorted.
There's probably a poem in that.
So really it's a sporting distinction here. The one that
As I
plays
was
golf, the other hurdle.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've been fiddling with this thing, and I haven't a clue how the last two lines connect with the rest. Can you please explain?
Well, can we wait till we all have established it first?
He's not going to read it out, he's just wondering for clarification
I
about
just-
how the
I
last
just
two lines
wouldn't
connect,
know how-
logically.
I wouldn't know how to go about doing the last two lines.
No. That's a really good
That's
point.
the challenge.
We can get on to that really because we've already established quite evidently that the poem has we've got images of flight from the butterflies to these aeroplanes, and obviously the last two lines are dealing with that. How they do it is one thing, but then we've also got this image of darkness and of loss.
Our days.
What?
Of our days.
Yeah, the days. So that's where it gets really quite complex, I think. It's in the second stanza where an analogy is being made between these paper aeroplanes being lost to sight and that being what happens to our days and our past. It's a kind of complex, extended and quite tenuous metaphor, if you follow me. Così i nostri giorni, an abisso meno dolce li accoglie. And then its comparison, where our days go, is even less or less sweet, less gentle, they gathered out, than this valley which presumably the planes are being launched into. And then we get this image of dead leaves, which is also quite a loaded autumnal image, and acque, that's waters autumnali. One other little thing before we get to the ending is that the word silente, which looks to me, it looks to us very much like just silent. It's not a usual Italian word. I think it's more poetic or archaic. It's kind of almost Latinate. Silente. I don't know, perhaps an Italian ought to, because this is the problem for a translator. When I first looked at it, I thought just naturally you translate silent or whatever. But then I thought about it. I'd never come across silente in Italian speech, and then I realised it's slightly unusual. Whether you want to register that when you come to it, when you're translating it, is another question. You may have to give that one up, because the risk of putting an archaic word in a poem is that you make your reader think you're an idiot, or you're trying to be poetic.
Can I check, because my Italian is only opera Italian, I confess my huge ignorance. K25 volano, is that K25, meaning the aeroplani, or is it K25 volano, that you make them to fly?
No, that would be volare.
So it's K25, and then volano.
I think it's, I would read it as a subordinate clause, if that's what I would. The aeroplanes that you make, they fly.
Right.
Because, obviously the agreement is plural volo.
Oh, right, so that's agreeing with aeroplani.
Yeah. Yeah, but it is quite strange, and also there's something unusual also for the. I'm going to have to be corrected by Italians here, but when you don't really need to say tu generally, but except in this case it is a direct address per Bernardo, but it's giving it a lot of emphasis by putting at the end of the line. The phi would just give you the second person.
I think that too is also there because for the final line of the poem, "I tuoi."
Yeah,
there is
lovely. Yeah, that's right.
There.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that.
That's a lovely curve of the poem, isn't it? Yeah, it's a good point.
Boys
sorry.
You can translate the present in two ways. So you can buy is you make and are making.
You make and are, you are making.
Yeah.
So
Oh yeah, it's in a continuous. Very it's
Well,
absolutely true.
it might work there, but
Yeah.
so this is a poem about time.
Yeah, yeah.
The are
It's
making.
it's going on. Yeah.
The child is
Fine.
away from you.
Yes.
The child for the dance.
There's a tense in Irish called the present habitual, which
Ah,
would be available to this.
Maybe it should be going to Irish. That it be, I mean, Italians do have the present continuous, but it's not as used as much as among us, really. I mean, che stai facendo? I mean,
That would be you're doing it now,
Yeah,
wouldn't it?
that's-
Not,
yeah.
It's more ponderous, is it?
Not you do it habitually.
It's
you're
more
doing it now.
ponderous.
It is much more ponderous. It doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound elegant. Mind you, the present continuous in English can be a bit heavy, and you kind of would try and avoid it.
Yeah.
But my Italian, as I said, is rude. But I have translated from 18th century Gaelic poetry into French, and contemporary French poetry into English, and contemporary Irish poetry in English into French. And I've observed in doing this, and this may be wrong, I observed this, and I wouldn't have agreed with it in principle, but it did seem to be so, that languages had characteristics. I mean, I'll take a very obvious example, translating Gillen to French. There's a great deal of expression of love and beauty in bodies, because it's representing Ireland and so on in the 18th century. And in English, and I don't mean to criticise the translators, translations always seem to be terribly scientific or a bit gross. Whereas in French, I think, correct me, I may be wrong, I don't believe in differences between peoples in essence,
So, yeah.
but it just seemed to be happening in poetry. In French, as in Irish, it seemed to be possible to speak clearly and plainly without becoming euphemistic or scientific or crass, referring to, her breasts and so on. In Irish and in French, it seemed to be just a plain word, an ordinary word. Whereas in English, it seemed to be Swinburnian or else, this struck me. I also found that when it came to rhyme schemes, Gaelic poetry has extremely complex prosody, and I didn't try to replicate that. Again, these are not models. I was right, I was wrong. I don't know. I triangulated in the case of the Dawn form, which is a very, very structured short form in Irish. I counted syllables as if for haiku, not the same numbers for haiku, but I tried to produce musicality in the sounds by counting syllables and using quite a lot of monosyllables and just getting an effect. And when it came to Anpowron, which is a later 18th century form, which uses internal rhyme, as you pointed out, a word at the end rhymes with a word in a sound in the middle. And there's a lot of assonance, rhyme of vowels.
Yeah.
So I didn't know what to do. It sounded funny in French. I tried using my minimal knowledge of Old and Middle English and use consonants, as you referenced earlier, rhyming consonants, a bit like Beowulf, to produce an effect of musicality, but not the same one, just some effect of effort.
I think that's.
So I found that triangulating through cultures could,
Well, it's great if you
could be
have
a way.
that resource. No, but I think it's very true, though, that you'll never actually get an exact equivalent for a rhythm or a sound, because even if, like from German poem in trochaic meter, you could do a trochaic poem in English. It wouldn't still have the exact same kind of cultural sense or an anapastic rhythm. I mean, anyway, Italian rhythms are different, so you're never going to get equivalent. I wouldn't think it's always worth working for that, but you would, as a translator, want to work with some image in your head or in your ear, which you've decided was a correspondence. So if you jettison one part of the poems, like if it's, let's say, Terza Rima in Dante, you might want to get a ghost of that going on in some form or other.
Yeah, my suggestion is it might be a different form. It might suit the language you're working
Okay,
into.
yeah, but I think that would make sense.
Yeah.
Because you are bringing, let's say the Terza Rima, you don't do a Terza Rima, but you get every third, lines A and C, having, 1 and 3, having some play, and some interlocking. I mean, it may be just a feeble ghost of it, but at least it gives you some sense of a structural principle.
Of an echo.
But in that case, you need it, because what happens with something like the Terza Rima, at least in Dante, that is to drag the narrative on. It is the interlocking lines to bring it forward. This is narrative poetry. It's very different from the kind of lyrical experience of poetry.
Yes, yes, it's true, but I mean, you know, terza rima can be used for lyric.
Yeah.
I mean, like Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, which kind of is a sonnet written in terza rima with couplet ending. I mean, just to give you an example, I mean,
But in that particular case, it's there to drag you forward, you know, and so therefore, if you are attempting some kind of rhyming scheme in English, with, like you said, the ghost version of the terza rima, yes, you need something to kind of help the momentum of the poem to move you forward.
it's interesting though, I mean, my example, Shelley is a poet who's very interested in momentum, and the Ode to the West Wind has this absolutely wonderful forward-moving surge to it, as does his poem, The Triumph of Life, which is more of an epic, well, broken off, but it's got that terrific sense of movement across with the terza rima. And maybe because it's slightly shorter, the English pentameter than the Italian hendecasyllable just goes a bit quicker. It makes his lines push onwards very impetuously. Because it is about, I mean, his poem is about speed. He talks about his former skyey speed.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, that's introduced a whole other very interesting category into the discussion, which is the idea of pace and movement within poetry. And this one, you know, it's a strangely circular one, which we're getting towards Matthew's question, I think. You know, everything goes round the metaphor, the imagery of the second stanza. I mean, though it is about movement and travel, it seems to be a travel that's kind of slightly truncated or curtailed. It's a really depressing poem to write to your little boy, I think. I think Bertolucci suffered very seriously from what he called melancholia, where actually we would probably call it clinical depression, but I like his term better.
Cheered up his son.
Melancholy is a cheerier term, maybe not, but it's...
The poem was very encouraging for his son.
Well, he's dealing with a lot of darkness here in the poem. It's offloading a lot of darkness on a poor kid. See what happened to him. It seemed to work all right for his career as a filmmaker. What about an answer to Matthew's question about...
I got it now. The version in the...
Oh yeah, it was just that was just a problem.
I didn't see the...
No, I'm sorry. That's that is the problem where it's in Italian. You can say dove posano, but we really need the verb later. So in fact, and that would make it very difficult to end an English translation of this poem on the same image of fragile gliders or Aliante. Could somebody explain that a bit better than gliders? I mean, it's things with wings or what was it? Come puoi spiegarlo proprio anche in italiano? Aliante, che cos'è?
Aliante is I think it's flying because
A flying thing.
the wings.
Well, ali is wings, so aliante is something.
Aliante, I think it's like volante.
Yeah.
Volante.
But because ali means wings, so
It means a flying thing, does it?
Well, that's what I would think. So I mean, gliders is not exactly a correct translation either. Even a literal translation is never correct.
But it's nice.
It's nice. Well, flying, fragile gliders. It looks like a nice. I didn't know if we've probably not got time to actually do it, but you have this one and the Merigiari Pallido e Assurdo, a very early Montali poem, which is I've given you. We won't go through it now, but it's an example of early Montali, which is fantastically rich on an acoustic level. So, you know, you've got all these sound effects like schiocchi di merli, frusci di serpi. You've got a lot of very powerful visual imagery as well. The rhyme scheme is quite. I think it's also quite complex. Couplets in the first one, vecchia intrecciano, that's a hypermetric rhyme, eccia and eccia, no. And then formiche biche, palpitare we go back to the couplet form, and then breaking out of the quatrain, a 5 thing with these wonderful kind of complex rhymes of Balia, Muralia, Meraviglia and Bottiglia, and very close to both of them, Travaglio. So it really is it's a bit of a tour de force. I don't know, Montpellier was about 19 or 20. It's a really early poem. I think it's a beautiful piece of work.
Great indeterminacy in it as well. All this kind of use of the infinitive form. Mediare, ascoltare, spiare, osservare, and then you have the gerund form andando.
Oh yes, that's very nice.
How you actually translate this is very, very difficult.
That is a real problem with it. I have done a translation of this one, and also because the infinitive in Italian has a different possibility that can be used in a gerundive form, really. As in for the noun, it stands in.
But then, if you're going to, you have it here in the literal translation as to pass, to hear, to spy, and that. But if you were to use passing and hearing and spying, when you then get to the gerund form, the andando,
then you've lost it.
You've lost that.
You've lost the change.
It is devilishly difficult. This problem.
And even that first word to start off with, merigiare. Who's heard of that? It's not dialect, but it's quite weird. I think, is it? I've never heard anyone in speech refer to merigio.
I think it's from D'Annunzio.
That's another stealing from D'Annunzio. And where did D'Annunzio get it? Is it a dialect form?
Where D'Annunzio got his language from?
And there is that one R.
Yes. Meriggiare.
Alright. Oh, that's a nice spelling mistake. Alright.
And then you also have the nominal form of the verb as well. Il palpitare.
Yes.
That's another one in there somewhere.
Oh, that's true.
Questo seguitare.
Yes. Later in stanza 3, osservari from the palpitare. So you've got the infinitive, and you've got the actually nominative form of the verb. It's a very, very complex thing. Strangely enough, I think it's probably easier to do, in my view, having done both of them, than the Bertolucci, which looks quite simple, lyrical, or whatever. Maybe I don't find getting the sound effects so difficult. But you pointed out immediately some of the difficulties you'd have with that one. But the sort of subtle, elusive quality of the Bertolucci poem, you can go wrong because it's quite simple lyrical tone, but the complexity happens all inside of it.
You have to also be aware of the kind of intertextuality that's going on here as well. There's a lot of Dante here.
In the Bertolucci or in the...
Sorry, in the Montale.
In the Montale.
It just kind of seems simple, but you have to be aware that Dante is very much present in there, especially in the first quatrain. That's Canto 13 of the Inferno.
That's interesting. Which particular thing, the one with
Sterpi,
the Reventimuro?
Sterpi and Serpi.
Oh, the Serpi, that's good.
And the Pruno. You see, Tom goes
Well, I think the intertextuality, actually I'm glad you raised that, because that's something that's very, very difficult. I may be wrong, but in the Bertolucci poem I also hear a reference to famous Spanish poem by Becker about los golondrinas, que no volverán, they will not return. No volverán is non torneranno più. It seems like, if you talk about the swallows not coming back, it's the same. It's a classical European poem that everyone kind of knows, and it's in our language too.
But can I ask the translators, I suppose, in the room, that when you come across something that is evidently intertextual, does that heighten your awareness? Do you translate differently, or are you going back to other translations then of the intertext? What do you do as a translator?
Well, again, I don't have an answer, but I've thought about it. It seems to me that it depends really on meta-translation. To take an example, one can imagine translating Jane Austen into German, because both traditions have a tradition of the romantic novel. Not the same period, but there is a romantic novel tradition. And therefore translation is possible, I would suggest. And maybe that isn't always the case really very difficult. In other words, does the intertextuality extend into the reception culture, is a question. If it does, then there will be methods, which might vary hugely. And if it doesn't, it will be very difficult. This is a point that you made earlier. There was a conference in London, I think about 10 years ago, where Arabic translators talked about getting very cross. And again, I'm not advocating this point, I just thought about it. Getting very cross if they felt that the translation of their work made it sound like natural English. They wanted it to sound foreign in translation. They would be unhappy if objective correlatives were found. Again, I was struck by the point of view, I don't think I share it, but I mean, one has to think about these things. I think some cultures have translated into each other philosophically already, which means that textual referentiality can find ways. And some haven't, and then it's an entirely different thing. And I think what happens in the second case is that someone translates, like Scott Moncrief translating Proust, a translation that is questioned today because it's very euphuistic and euphemistic and sort of dated. But then it made Proust readable, I think, and acceptable, intelligible to an English readership. And then once he'd done that, which was an impossible task, but was done as he could do it, and I would think very well in its time, then other people have done more recent translations, because now the meta-translation had happened, the cultures had encountered each other. At least, again, just a suggestion.
There's a translation, there's one by Antonella Anedda about a child's first communion, where she quotes a line from a very well-known song in Irish, and Paul Muldoon, translating it, put in a line of Yeats, which again would have, it filled that gap, and it created. I'm not saying that I would have done it, but
it's a cultural bridge.
It was a reminder, I think. Now, quite possibly the same people would have recognised both the line of Yeats and the line of the song. So maybe what he was asking for was not understanding of the original, but applause for his skill in finding the equivalent. Which I think, again, I think that's perhaps legitimate. But I think again, there are obvious things like biblical references, proverbs, which are often the same in different languages.
Childhood things, child stories.
Yeah, there are. I mean, there are ways in which you can do this, I suppose. And if you choose to translate, if those are the ones that attract you into translating. What's the date of the Bertolucci poem?
What is the
date?
I should know, but I've got a feeling it's in his first couple of books, so that would put it, I'm thinking actually it's a very good point, is it late 1930s or was it 1950s? Is it either I'm not sure whether it's before or after the war.
I think before.
Before. Yeah. Do you think that you see something of a kind of gathering gloom of the European condition there?
No, actually, what I was thinking of one of Primo Levi, Frati, is that Fratelli Umani? Which is not gloomy stuff like this. But one feels that Levi is entitled to be gloomy. And I wondered which of them came first. That was all.
This was the first.
Yes.
There is a kind of a bit of a tradition of that. I don't know, crepusculism, or that sense of an earlier generation of slightly gloomier, poetic. I guess the sort of turn of the century English verse had something of that too.
Or even, I mean, you get in, Thomas Gray's Prospect of Eton College, unconscious of their doom, the little victims play.
The Gothic aspect.
The word abyss always reminds me of Baudelaire.
Which does?
The abyss, it's a very 19th century word, isn't it?
Well, you're absolutely spot on with the Baudelaire because, I think he's the key author for... He's actually written a whole book with Baudelaire in the title, a book of his essays, and which is... So I think, definitely the abyss. As well.
For someone who doesn't speak speak Italian, it's a lot easier to translate the Bertolucci into French than into English. That's a confession, not a claim. But it fits very readily into French, the geometry of the sentence.
Oh, well, at least the ending wouldn't be a problem as it would be for English.
Quite, yeah.
I mean, you can get around it in English, but you'd have to have something reinforcing it. I was just thinking, the idea of intertextuality and references, literary references. I mean, there are Elaine's idea of it was a Nuala poem that Paul Muldoon had translated, which was I think that's a very clever way of doing it. But as you say, it's excluding perhaps one portion of people who would have heard in both both the original Irish and the English. I mean, you know, one could, for example, when there's a reference to Dante, import something from Milton. It's not the same.
It might be equivalent.
It might, yeah. It just might be signalling that sense of a reference back to the past of the language and culture. Yeah.
Can I mention something? I was in Lucknow with the British Council, and there was a big translation seminar, and the Bengalis had translated Eliot's The Love Song of Alpha J. Prupa, and there was a huge row because the Bengalis had replaced "in the room the women come and go" talking of Michelangelo. They put in a Bengali painter instead, and people said, "You can't do that." And they said, "Well, you can do that. Nobody here knows about Michelangelo." And it was almost came to blows.
I mean, that's a good example. I think it's legitimate, but you kind of make up your own rules for translation. I mean, if they can make it good lines in
theory. I think some theories are produced by practitioners and some are produced by people who are not, I don't quite know what word to use, but who are spectators rather than actors in translation. They're both interesting and valid. I'm not making a hierarchy. I'm just saying they're very different. And I think the distinction that I would try to make clear to my students, some of whom are here, is if a theory can be turned into a methodology, a method for translating, that's one type of theory. Yeah. And then some theories neither intend to nor can do that, and they also exist. And the one is helpful to translators and the other is more for analysis of the result of translation. Yeah. I suppose we'd say one is at the level of inscription poetics, and the other kind of theory is at the level of reception or aesthetics. Yeah. And you know, that being clear, I'm fine with both, but not to confuse them because...
I know. Yeah, I mean, I've often, dreamed or fantasized about, developing a course on teaching how, the translation of poetry. And every time I try to imagine myself teaching the translation of poetry, I freak out and I then run away thinking, no, because you know what the image I have? I have the image in my head that I'm sitting there in front of a group of students with the method and then the poem, and I say to the students, now, go and do the translation and apply the method to the poem, and I can't ever imagine doing that, you see?
Well, you're now terrifying me because I do teach some.
I'd love to hear how
poetry, but I hope my students will say I don't do it like that.
Yeah.
There isn't a method. But and having said that, to be honest, I do have to say that I believe that to translate a poetry is to be an author, and people like John F. Dean, who translates Thomas Tanturmo, would agree with that, as with Shane Massini, as people know. But then, to be honest, I believe that as a translator, that's true anyway. You're the author of a new text. It will have different dimensions in the world of human activity. It may not be a poetic dimension. But you're always taking an authorial responsibility, and you've got to be creative. Yeah. But we can leave that aside, I suppose, as we're talking about poetry. Yeah. I don't think there'd be a magical transformer. No. There wouldn't be a Google Translate for poetry, but then I don't believe it works for anything important other than the cat's out of the mat, for which you didn't need it in the first place. I think the human creativity has to come in. Just with poetry, it's intensified. It's language charged with meaning, I suppose. Yeah. But I did feel I had to speak a little bit for translation studies and for teaching the translation of poetry. I'll kill myself now.
I'm also not averse to footnotes. I mean, occasionally, like with Antonella's poem about Atitos for a graveside mourning. Well, it's a Sardinian kind of habit of the women of the family improvising verses at the grave. Well, you could call it laments or whatever. I mean, there are traditions like in Scotland or whatever, but I think just a footnote can help. You know, I don't mind the apparatus as long as it's not too intrusive. Likewise for prose. I mean, I'm having a bit of a tussle at the moment with the question of how many footnotes to put in the Giorgio Bassani story. You know, there are lots of things he's put acronyms for, which are, you know, little student fascist organisations, which are now forgotten. If you had Italian, you could look it up on Wikipedia, but if you're English, you wouldn't get it in Wikipedia. So, yeah, I'm all for putting footnotes, even if it clutters.
Would you not put a glossary at the end, maybe?
Or, yeah, I'd be happy with endnotes, you know. The reason is that, I mean, I appreciate the idea that a novelist, you want the flow of the prose. On the other hand, you know, Bassani is also not just a novelist, but he's also bearing witness to a historical event for the Jewish community in 1938. It's very, very geographically and historically specific. And so that element of the witness, you know, I think is a great bonus, and the quality of Bassani, I don't want it lost, just for ease of reading, you know.
What do you think about dual publication, you know, the original poem and the translation face-to-face?
Of dual like,
being able to publish,
this one of Antonella's is dual.
Most of them now.
I think I mentioned this yesterday, but I slightly prefer having the dual because it's just two for the price of one. But on the other hand, you know, Faber have done, because they have a habit, probably instituted by T.S. Eliot, not to do dual text. And I also quite like that because I do think it's not the best way of reading a poem when your eye is jumping from one side. You know, it's like a pedagogic exercise. Oh, well, that's wrong. I want to conceal my faults. No, it's not that. It's just that, you know, one could read it straight through and then go back and then do the scholastic comparison, but it's a very interfering way of reading a poem. So I think there is arguments for both. I think given the choice, the American edition of Magrelli, the Americans are much more insistent on it. I'm quite happy, but it's a bigger book, so less easy to put in your pocket. I think there is an argument for both sides of that.
Do you not feel, though, I mean, given the context, you mentioned earlier on about the hegemony of the English language, you know, that we have to in some way kind of insinuate, let those other languages in, even if people are going to ignore them.
That's a good argument.
It's almost a political act at this stage, because it's become too much.
I take that point. I fell foul of, I remember in this conference in Pordenone, this poet I had included, I made a mistake there, in my anthology of the Faber, publicly attacked me on this score. But I thought, I was trying to defend it. I mean, he was talking about l'egemonia britannica, and I said, you know, like, you're making a political point out of something that actually, it isn't politics, it's probably economics, as if Faber doesn't want to pay the bills. You know, you have to pay a lot for an anthology, to pay some of, you know, Montali estate, whatever. I mean, you know, it becomes prohibitive. So, you know, they're economics rather than the superiority of English over other languages.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but let's say you go down to Waterstones today, and the majority, let's forget about poetry for a second, the majority of novels that you will read are not translated novels, but they're English-speaking novels. They're from American authors, Australian authors, Irish authors, English authors, British authors. And there just seems to be this abundance, predominance of English-speaking authors and very little translation. Forget about dual texts. Or at least that's what's been offered to the general reader.
I think there's been a decline in translation, which isn't the case in Italy or France or Germany. They translate a lot.
Yeah, and that's the point.
Germany,
in the English-speaking world, that there has been a falling off. But if you go to France and you go to bookshops in France, I would say the predominance are books that have been.
But are they translated from English, which would prove the hegemony point? Like, you know, it's all going really well in the other direction.
They've been translated from every language, but translation is alive and well, kind of thing, you know.
And you know, I find out about Hungarian writers, Chinese writers when I go into Italian bookstores in a way that I don't in English bookstores.
Yeah.
Non-English cultures translate a lot from English, and English doesn't reciprocate it to the same extent.
It's true. Yeah, I was always impressed with my French friends. They were reading Japanese novels and, you know, Icelandic novels, and they were very aware of world literature, you know, which I wasn't to the same extent. You know.
And to some extent, I suppose, the translation into English, though, facilitates people for whom English is not their first language. I mean, just as, say, when I was a student, you would look for a text and you'd find that it wasn't translated into English, but you could read it in French because of the big tradition of translation into French. But I think perhaps people are failing, not just English-speaking readers, but readers from other cultures, by not translating into English, and so many people know it. Yeah. Is that a sort of contradictory?
People who know English don't know so many languages. But people who, you know, there's
people who know English because they've learned it could read, say, Chinese or Japanese.
But I meant the other way around, that there's probably a perception that English speakers, native English speakers, are less inclined to learn other languages than, you know, partly for education reasons and partly because they have the hegemony, and, you know, so that they're less likely to be able to translate because they, you know, they're feeling that in England the languages aren't, and in Ireland as well, that we're not great at languages and feel we don't have to be.
There is a certain amount of encouragement. I mean, I wouldn't have figures now, but France has quite a lot of literary prizes, as we know, and a number of them are for translation. And Europe used to have a Prix Aristillon. I'm one of the people who was on the jury at one stage, and they had quite a lot of money for translation, literary translation, cultural translation. But again, it stopped. And as far, it did, I'm afraid. And it was a pity because it produced a lot of things, you know. Am I right in having the impression that that kind of structure, prizes or bursaries for literary poetic translation, are falling off?
There are some. I mean, there's the Popescu Prize for European poetry translation, isn't there? And there must be a couple of others.
Is
that the Weidenfeld?
The Oxford-Weidenfeld, now it used to be the Weidenfeld, and now it's the Oxford-Weidenfeld. That it can be prose or it can be poetry. So it's not exclusive, but that's quite nice. I think it's then. There's a couple of them. There's one for Italian, John Florio, and there's one for German. And the Popescu is for poetry from any languages, really. And it's quite a good one, I think, for that.
But are they reducing on those prizes? They're falling off a bit, are they?
I'm not sure. The question of grants is another one. Is that, like, I don't think the local English Arts Council gives any help to translation of their poets to other languages, whereas the Scottish and the Welsh and the Irish give help. I don't quite know why the English just don't want to promote their poets at all, but I think that is the distinction. So what you notice in Italy, for example, is it may be that they just think the Scots and the Welsh are a lot better, but there's a predominance of Scots and Welsh and I think Irish poets, and very few English, because the translations don't sell sufficiently. Therefore, they need the publishing houses need sponsorship. But
the Irish outfit, which is changing its name, so I won't say it, gives grants for the majority of grants are given for translation of prose because, of course, to translate a novel takes it takes a lot longer. If you're paying for a translation, the translator's fee is usually very much smaller when it comes to poetry, and there's often a suspicion that it has actually gone towards the printer's bill, and the translator hasn't been paid at all. But you do have they do only pay when they see the receipt from the translator. So there must. But I think some translators perhaps collude.
And I wonder what are the career structures for literary translators. I know that in Trinity there's an MA in literary translation, and one of our students did it a couple of years ago. But I don't know, what the uptake is, and can you make a living as a literary translator? Is it easy? Is it hard?
People who do make a living spend some of their time translating the instructions for washing machines.
I should try that.
Or else if you're translating Harry Potter, obviously.
Or if you get some big contract.
But I wouldn't like to speak as if I had sort of figures, but people I know in the Irish Translators and Interpreters Association would tend to say literary translation, it's very difficult to make a living.
I would
say certain cases.
We started that course in the hope of in the expectation that we would get people who were recent graduates in the language schools who wanted to do a bit more. And in fact, what we did get, almost predominantly, I think, was people who were already doing quite a lot of professional translation and who wanted to, who just wanted a piece of paper to show they were able to do it, and possibly also wanted to take a year when they were doing this and able to enjoy it and think about it, and of course to learn from each other, which is one of the great advantages, I think, of a master's course like that.
But if
They
you're
were already
talking
employed in the profession.
with the finances, I mean, they're so prohibitive because where possible, the publishing houses give either no royalties or 1.5%. Now you imagine 1.5%, how many hundreds of thousands of copies do you actually have to sell in order to even pay back your advances? You need to sell probably about 70,000 before you'd start even making an impact on your advance. If your advance was 4,000, let's say. But if you imagine, it might take you, well, something like me is just dead slow, but it would take a year sometimes to do a novel for which you're being paid £3,000. So £3,000 is not really a living wage. And when I get really slow, I'm working for about £1.5, £2 an hour for the labour. And the Sani is really laborious for me. I just want to be free of it, actually. So I wouldn't recommend it as a career prospect.
But one can do it in connection with other kind of translation.
Yeah, extra to something else.
Yeah, you make €3 an hour if you went faster.
There is a lot of variation because this was between what people are paid in different countries. Again, people in the Scandinavian countries, in Holland and France, are paid something a bit closer to a living wage at any rate.
I'm sure, yeah. And I don't think in Italy they are really. It's almost like honorary. I don't think in Italy they pay translators a lot.
No, not at all.
It's not really. But they do continue to do it. I think you can't really do it you've got to do it for love of the book, but it would be nice if they give you a wee bit more encouragement to love it.
But in a way, what you're saying is because you do it for love, the translations are better.
More embittered, maybe.
Unless you get so frustrated or starved, then you fall out of love with your mestiere.
It's a wonderful act of generosity, I always think. If somebody is working at a full-time job and they take it upon themselves or they're trying to make their living in another way, to translate the poetry of so-and-so or whatever, it's a very generous thing to do, actually. Because you are then, if the author is still alive, opening up new horizons for that author, a part of the world maybe that the author can now travel in and maybe give readings, and it's quite a generous thing to do, I suppose. If anyone.
It's a challenge with your own language, because you have to choose, so you have to avoid superfluous.
Absolutely.
If it's done badly, you're killing their reputation.
Well, that's true. If it's done badly, you're killing them. Yeah.
And you're also killing the prospect of a decent translator who might do
forget the whole idea of generosity.
It's generous if you're good, otherwise it's annoying.
It's a good point, but also that one, I was just thinking, like Brancati's an author I like, a Sicilian novelist, and he didn't get a very good translation, and I think that's killed off his prospects for the next 10 years or 15 years, unless somebody else can come in, because the reception was
You're a menace.
The cynics around the table.
No, your point stands.
But I know what you mean.
A good translation is a gift.
But sometimes, what you get very strange anomalies or examples, like Il Gattopardo, when that was translated into English by Archipelago. It was a huge success in the English-speaking world, and then it was translated very well. I forget who the translator was into French. And this novel in Italian had been criticised really badly by the left-wing say, oh, this is rubbish, this is a retrogressive novel, and then all of a sudden the French and the English-speaking world are waxing lyrical about it. And then the Italians had to reevaluate it and reread it.
I didn't realise that. What I did know,
And Giorgio Bassani, your man, was very much at the forefront of getting it published in the first instance.
He did actually have that role. He spotted the book, and I mean there are other ones that he's criticised for not having spotted, but actually that one he did get credit for. What I didn't realise is that the reception of the Lampedusa was kind of re-imported from English and French reception.
It was the same for Spavo.
Yes,
For Spavo,
because they criticised Spavo's language, his Italian.
Yeah, but where did Spavo make it in Britain or?
Well,
or in France?
It was through the Joyce. Essentially, Joyce was the one who was advertising him as a writer, and Joyce was the one who encouraged him to write.
I knew there was a connection, but I wasn't even sure that Joyce had read La Coscienza di Zeno. Certainly, Sincerità.
He did, because I think Joyce was one of the first people that Spavo sent the manuscript to. Yes, again, like you're saying, he was one of those people who was brought back into Italy and recast, reconsidered.
Unless, I mean, I'm happy being here, but I mean, maybe...
No, I think that's it. Would anyone like to read out their translation?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
We could finish with that, yeah?
I'm sorry, it was like a false exercise.
No, it wasn't.
Some of us did it, some of us did it.
We take this very seriously.
Well, maybe we should give another hour.
No. So, would anyone like to read out there? We could take several translations and just hear the different variations then, if you
that
like.
That would be very good. Sorry.
So you can just jump in. Whoever wants to go first. Yeah, John.
I don't want to go last. The paper airplanes you fold into evening get lost, like moths in the bedtime light. They're not coming back. This is how our days disappear, swallowed less sweetly than by this deadlocked valley of yellow leaves and October rain, where your crumpled birds run out of air.
That's an understanding as well.
Nice, very nice. Good. Excellent. Anyone else? Matthew, do you want to read yours? You do?
Antonella, do you want to translate it into Italian? or Logan Reeves is easy.
Sarah, would you like to read?
No, I was kind of listening and I stopped doing it. So
Right,
yeah,
but you can the first stanza if you
Do you
want.
want to read the first stanza?
I'm okay. No, I'm okay.
Anyone else? Angela?
I'll read the French one, but no one has to take it down or compare me to Jacques Gaultier.
Okay.
I've just done it now, and I don't speak
Well
Italian. Les petits planeurs que tu formes volent dans le crépuscule, se perdent comme des papillons de nuit dans l'air qui s'obscurcit, ne pouvant revenir. Tels vont nos jours, mais un abîme moins doux les accueille que cette vallée muette de feuilles mortes et d'eau d'automne, où se posent les ailes lasses de tes fragiles ailerons.
Very nice.
Yeah, it's
Are
very
you right
close
about
to
the
the
structure,
Italian.
the structure of the syntax and everything working?
Yeah. Do you have a German version?
Not really, but I'm beginning to think about it.
Yeah. We'll come back to you next week.
And okay, 2 lines if you want.
Yeah, go.
Kleinen Flieger, die du faltest und in die Dämmerung schickst, verlieren sich wie nächtliche Schmetterlinge. And so on.
Sounds lovely.
I like the German word falten. Folding of the
Folding.
instead of making.
Ah, yeah. Well, that's
Yes,
nice.
I use farm rather
Did you
than
say
fair.
fold?
Yeah.
I did.
Yes, I've got folding as well. It seems to come up.
Appeal to
come
people,
up
yeah.
it's not there.
Folded wing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
The little aeroplanes you make from paper fly in twilight like the moths. They are lost in again. So to our days, but the abyss that opens for them is not as gentle as the valley of dead leaves and the rains of autumn, where your fragile gliders fold down their weary wings.
That's great. It's rhythmically very poised as well.
Yes, that's very nice.
Just a final question, Antonella, how do you respond to any Italians here? Do you think our description of the lyrical elements is correct, or is there something else here?
I was listening to, and also the German, comparing to the Italian and the original. The original is it's not so. It has not some music. It's not so musical. In English, the translations sound very with a much more rhythm. The rhythm is beautiful, but it's very different from the original. Because, for example, I had not difficult, but it's a bit strange in Italian. For example, I piccoli aeroplani di carta che tu fai. There is a comma to understand, because it's a if I didn't know the poem, it was volano, it's volano. We have another word for volano. Nel crepuscolo si perdono come farfalle notturne. I was thinking that Bertolucci was avoiding crepuscularism, no writing Falene. We have the name Falene, but there is Gozzano. In Gozzano there is we can find a lot of la Falena, and in Montale also. And after, si perdono come farfalle notturne nell'aria che si oscura, non torneranno più. There is like a step in Italian, non torneranno più. It's not so fluid. Così i nostri giorni, ma un abisso meno dolce li accoglie di questa valle silente di foglie morte di acque autunnali, dove posano le loro stanche ali i tuoi fragili alianti, silenti alianti. There is something that is sleeping from the rhyme and the
it's
rhythm.
It's a disturbance in the language.
Yes, it's a disturbance. Exactly. I like it.
Yeah.
I like
so
it.
That's
but it's very difficult to deliver the same strangeness.
Yes, we were going for flow, and I suppose that's what you do when you're.
But maybe I'm wrong.
But that's the trouble with not speaking the language. You've no sense of that it's jerky or sort of slipping away in Italian. If you're going on a crib, you just sort of think, oh, these are the words. But
it all hinges on that non torneranno più. There's something. It's almost like a parent not giving out to a child. It's just saying
they won't come back.
They're not coming back. So they aren't coming back.
Just as at the end, the mention of water seems to me to relate very directly to the wings, which are posing, because as the paper gets wet, of course, it droops and planes, the gliders fall. Although you do get gifts, it's like Mary's generosity, you do get gifts in translation. For example, papillon de nuit is what people tend to say for moths, as it happens, and it is butterflies of the night. So that's a little gift that French gives, it seems to me. I think that happens too. It keeps us going.
Okay, so I think we'll draw proceedings to a close. It's been absolutely fascinating. I think I've really enjoyed it myself, and that is largely due to Jamie McKendrick's wonderful seminar. Thank you.